Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So there's definitely an understanding out there that training is a process of stressing your body, and then you have to recover in order to get better, which is great, right? Because I think that potentially in the past, the recovery side of that equation wasn't as emphasized as it potentially should have been. But then the flip side of that is now that people have a better understanding of recovery from their training as being an important aspect of getting better, it's sort of fallen prey to a lot of the same stuff that happens when, anything becomes sort of commoditized, right? There's a lot of sort of sketchy, gimmicky, overly mechanistic, complex explanations of how recovery works that are sort of designed to sell people products or have them do things that are, going to be really at best marginal gains in their ability to recover. And it's not touching on the big picture issues that people need to be thinking about if they are thinking about how they're recovering from their training, right? Because it is a huge aspect of getting better. It's like, yeah, you got to be able to recover. You have to be able to adapt to the stress that you're putting on your system through your training. And if you're not recovering, you're not getting better. But it doesn't mean that the best way to recover is to, have some weird little gun that kind of rubs your thighs for you, and that you have certain supplements that you take and you jump in an ice bath every once in a while. Like that's not recovery. That stuff can be helpful potentially, but that's not what we're actually talking about if we're thinking about the best way to recover from training. So Luke, what do you see, going on in the market and with clients and all that kind of stuff with the way that people are thinking about their recovery?
Well, I think that the sort of quick fix culture is, that's a little bit part of the gimmicks that we've seen and sort of the focus around that. If you think about the development of CrossFit, it very much was sort of started off and everyone would train pretty much every day. Training volume wasn't necessarily high enough to really focus on recovery or have to. But then as the sport has developed and as training volumes have increased fairly significantly, we start to see things like active recovery, getting snuck into people's training. And then you start to see people paying more attention towards the sort of, their soft tissue work, their sleep, their nutrition, and things like that. But then also, as you said, these sort of more tactical things like, should I sauna or should I do, cold water exposure? Should I do breathing drills, or should I buy this, massaging gun, or should I get these, certain supplements to help with recovery? Not talking about the sort of the borderline illegal supplements, but
Sure.
but does drinking this special tea allow me to sort of relax and allow me to help me sleep at night and all this type of stuff? I think the main focus has to be on, first of all, your sleep and your nutrition, and you can pretty much take care of most things there. You have to train smart. You have to make sure that you're not killing yourself in the gym every single day. There needs to be periods where you are, bringing the intensity down, and that happens throughout the week, but then also throughout training cycles. You can't be running hot all the time and then expect that just a bunch of recovery methods are going to help you. But I think that there's actually a large psychological component to it as well. For me personally, I would do certain things to assist with recovery, and a lot of it would be because I felt better after it. I felt more refreshed or something like that. For instance, doing sauna and stuff like that, I used to do that on a fairly regular basis, and I wasn't really, I would say that it wasn't really having too much of a positive effect on how I was recovering. It sort of had that, what they call it, the sort of sympathetic rebound, where it, you get essentially exposed to a stressor and the sort of heat stress, but then what it does is it sort of pushes you into a bit of a parasympathetic and more of a recovery state post sauna. The sort of same happens with cold water exposure as well. But the main thing, I enjoyed doing it because It allowed me to relax. It gave me some time away from, the sort of stimulus of work and training and phone and this and that. And a lot of it was just for me just to have some sort of thinking space, and then also just to sort of feel relaxed after it. And I think that the psychological component behind that was probably greater than the actual physiological component of improving parasympathetic drive post sauna. So I think that you have to figure out what is going to be effective for you, what is something that you enjoy doing, something that's not going to be too much friction to actually get going. But then as well as that, understand that, the best recovery tools are right in front of you, and it's making sure that you sleep well and you sleep enough, and that you eat high quality foods, and you make sure that you are fueled enough for your training, and you're not doing anything that's going to be pulling away from that. But then again, this is a rabbit hole that people can go down, and I think sometimes they can go down it a little bit too deep, and it ends up becoming this real sort of, I'm going to hit it really hard for 6 months, and then all of a sudden it drops off, and then they stop doing it altogether.
Yeah, totally. I think it might be helpful to try to frame out what are the most important variables for impacting recovery, and how much potentially we can expect those to actually change our training results, and to really think about what aspects we have control over, right? So by far the most important variable that impacts someone's recovery is who their parents are, which is an unpopular opinion that, doesn't feel so good to say, because it's not like, oh yeah, make sure that you have a vision board that shows all the stuff that you want and you'll be able to get it. It's not, make sure you read enough Stoic philosophy and then you'll be able to adapt to your training. It's not just really try super hard and put forth effort and make sure you really want it and you'll get better, right? It's like, if you have the right genes, you can potentially handle a lot more training volume and get better from it a lot faster than other people. And again, that's not a feel-good story, because that sort of says some people can do this and other people can't. But I think that is the reality. If anyone has actually coached a lot of different people, especially if you've seen some people who are in fact at an elite level in performance, it's very obvious that they can do more training, can get better from it faster, and can recover from it more quickly. And it's not because they're, again, reading Stoic philosophy and meditating, and that they have like a complicated morning routine. Some of them might, but others don't. Others, do everything wrong. They undereat. They don't sleep enough. They have terrible mobility. They screw up all their training protocols and like do everything wrong, and they still do more stuff and get better faster. But I mean, this is something we don't have control over, right? You don't actually have control over your ability, just like on a genetic level, to just handle training volume and get better from it. So that's by far the most important variable, but it's the one that we can do the least about, right? Then if we think about, okay, well, what's the second most important variable? I would say that's following a training program that stresses you appropriately relative to where you are. Right. So if we think about training, and we talked about this in the intro, as being a stress on the system intended to create some sort of adaptation, the load of that stress needs to be appropriate to that individual, meaning that if it's not enough stress, it doesn't actually create adaptation. And if it's too much stress, that can blunt adaptation or potentially cause short-term adaptation and long-term problems, or result in, injury, overtraining, et cetera. So that's something we can actually control. Are you doing something that is the appropriate level of challenge for you? And finding that is difficult, because that means that you actually have to, understand your current capacity, understand how much stuff you can adapt to, and understand what is actually an appropriate level of challenge, meaning that you're potentially trying to go a little bit faster on some row repeats, that you're trying to do, a few more chest to bar pull-ups in your weekly sessions. It may mean that you're trying to add a few pounds to, your max snatch, something like that. But finding that sweet spot where you're being stressed but not overly so, I think, is the second most important thing. And then third is the lifestyle factors that you mentioned, right? I mean, I'd be hard pressed to say whether, sleep or nutrition or whatever is more important. It probably depends on the individual, since I think that if either of those is way out of line, that can cause some serious problems. But that's, again, something we actually have control over, is making sure you're getting enough sleep, making sure your nutrition is appropriate to your activity level. And those are the big things that actually matter, right? Number one, who are your parents? No control over that, but someone can have the right parents and just completely outperform and outcompete and outrecover someone who's doing everything else right. And again, it doesn't feel good to say it, but it's true. Number two is, are you training appropriately relative to your current capacity, right? Number three is all these lifestyle factors that actually matter, like sleep and nutrition. And then everything else is going to be marginal gains, right? If you just sort of think about how much can someone move up or down in terms of their ability to recover outside of those three things, based upon, again, mobility, correctly timed ice baths, supplements, reading Stoic philosophy, etc. Like it's marginal at best. You're not going to be able to change the characteristics of your ability to recover from those first three things by any of those marginal tactics.
Yeah, and I think that you could almost basically sort of like visualize a pyramid, with at the bottom of the pyramid being essentially your genetic ceiling, then looking at the training program that you're doing, then as you go up the pyramid, that goes into lifestyle factors, and at the very, very top you have all of those different tactical things that you can do. What we quite often see is, for instance, a lot more cerebral elite athletes, sort of paying attention to these things at the top of the pyramid. But what you also have to understand is that those individuals probably have a hell of a lot of training volume under their belts, and they've probably been paying attention to those sort of marginal gains throughout their career, and also in their competitive history before they even started CrossFit. So these are going to be the people that cooled down after sports practice and took care of all those different things. And what I think often happens is that you have people that want to sort of use these people as examples, and I think that's all great, but everything at the bottom of the pyramid they take care of, and it's like a non-negotiable. They don't really focus on all of these little tactical things too much, but they have the habits ingrained of making sure that they eat the right foods, making sure that they are doing the right training program, they're training to create the right response, but then as well as that, they're taking care of sleep and all those other factors. And what I think a lot of people do is they sort of try to just skip all of those elements in front, and then they jump straight to the top. And like you said, it's like no amount of growth mindset or Stoic philosophy is going to be changing your sort of genetic potential in this sport. And I think that as the sport grows, and as obviously we have the sort of catchment of talent increase, we're going to start to see people coming through who are going to be doing absurd things physically because they are built for it. And we see this happening in certain areas of the world where, CrossFit is really, really emerging. I don't necessarily, I think, we're not necessarily going to see a crazy growth as, say, for instance, as we have seen over the last, say, 5 years or so. But, there's people out there that can do, they're built for the sport, and they can recover better than everyone else, even if they have all of those different things dialed in and going in the right direction. What I think people need to do is take care of the low-hanging fruit first, make sure that they have that, be aware of what you're going through, and don't try to fool yourself by thinking that all of the very, very sort of small little details and the extra bits of movement work or this, that, and the other, that's all going to make significant changes on your performance. I think that if you especially if you've been doing this for a while, excuse me, if you've been going through competitive style training for a number of years now, you probably have to sort of get not necessarily used to the idea of you have to get used to the idea of not progressing as much, but you just have to frame the idea of progression differently. And we've spoken about that on a few podcasts before, and it's about making sure that you take care of that low-hanging fruit, you build the habits as best as you can, you make it sort of almost like a bit of a second nature, and then you can start worrying about the different methods and things like that you can use. I think the the best investment of money that you can have on your recovery is just making sure that you're you're getting all the groceries that you need for the week. And it's just about making sure that you're taking care of that before you're trying to save up money for a EMS device or whatever it is.
I want to circle back to something that you said, because you mentioned the phrase genetic ceiling, which despite my unhappy unpopular message previously, I actually don't necessarily like thinking of things in terms of genetic ceilings. They may potentially exist, right? I do think there are biological trade-offs in terms of how good people can get at certain things, especially in a sport like CrossFit, where you're attempting to trade off these different capacities of muscle endurance and aerobic capacity and strength and explosiveness and all those different seemingly contradictory traits. But I don't necessarily like to think of things as, oh, this is your genetic ceiling and you've reached it. But what I do think is more of the genetic variable is how much training can you tolerate and how quickly can you adapt to it? And then how much better do you get from the actual training itself, right? So if we think of this in terms of the actual rate of change, I think the rate of change that someone experiences relative to training is something that is going to be largely genetically determined. But that doesn't mean that other people can't continue to get better, right? I've seen it over and over again where someone, seems to not get better very fast, but they just kind of keep going and they keep getting better over time. Like long past when you'd be like, okay, well, they've reached their potential. They're not someone who's super talented for the sport, but if they just keep training, they can actually make a lot of improvements. It's just going to be slower, right? And in terms of competing in the sport, that can be an uncomfortable conversation because it's like, okay, well, what do you expect to happen in order to make you able to compete with the people who are currently elite? Because they are already better than you and get better faster than you. So how do you expect to catch up, right? Especially if your rate of adaptation isn't as fast. And that's not to say that people can't, again, get better over time, because they can, but it's much more about that specific rate of change in terms of understanding okay, what does my trajectory look like if I do continue to dedicate myself to this sport?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I probably should have said genetic potential rather than ceiling, because I think as well, what we have to understand is that CrossFit is such a varied sport whereby the potential of someone reaching their limit as such I don't necessarily think that that's going to be happening. You can always adjust things and you can always try to tinker around with things to see how people are going to actually develop in the sport. And almost, as people get more advanced, what you're trying to do is you're sort of trying to figure out, what the, if you take it, sort of simple idea is when you're sort of trying to create a character on a computer game and you're trying to sort of bring up all of these different levels of, speed, power and all this type of thing. It's a little bit like that. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to tinker around with that based off of where they want to compete and the sort of level of competition that they want to compete in. Obviously, it's not a sport like, say, track and field or weightlifting, whereby the pursuit is a lot more singular in focus, and the potential of someone reaching their limit is the potential of that is a lot higher. But even then, there's so many different factors that you can take into consideration. And I think that when people do start to find that progress really slows down, that's sort of like, where you can get a little bit more fluffy, and you can start thinking about, okay, well, why am I doing this? What is the purpose of me trying to get better? It feels like I'm not getting better, especially compared to what was happening previously. And at that stage, you've just got to understand that every competition is going to be different. There's the sport is never the same, and what you're trying to do is you're just trying to make sure that you can sort of continually adapt. And it's not an easy sport to hang around in for a long time, because there's a level of unpredictability that occurs. You're going to have one set of qualifiers that really go your way, but then you're going to have another set of qualifiers where all the workouts aren't in your quote-unquote wheelhouse. And it's just about trying to make sure that you can play around with things in order to try to make sure you get the best expression of yourself in competition over a long, long period of time.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's potentially worthwhile to try to dig into the concept of stressing yourself appropriately relative to your current capacity, right? Because I think that that's the most important thing that people can actually control and take some action on. And we have other podcasts talking about nutrition. I don't know if we've really talked much about sleep, but I think those are the other things that people can really control that are going to make a huge difference in their ability to recover. But I do think that the actual training program itself relative to someone's capacity is even more important than those. So, I mean, if we think about this, we mentioned this previously, right? But the goal is to actually stress an organism such that it adapts. And if that stress is too low, you don't get adaptation. If it's too high, you start to get problems. So how do we think about actually creating an appropriate level of stress for someone? Like what are your thought processes in terms of designing that training program, making up specific workouts, putting together a weekly template, understanding where someone is at in a sport? What does that look like for you?
Well, I think that like when I start working with people, the sort of the general direction is to create a lot more structure to go through what we call accumulation phases, whereby we're trying to get a little bit more work done, a little bit more volume done each week, to sort of create some level of base. And then as people get closer to competition, but then also sometimes it's good to do this in the training year, or even if you don't have a competition, but you want to then go through some stage of like intensification where you're trying to get someone to realize their potential, and that's where you might be working higher paced efforts in your sort of conditioning, in your energy system work. You might be working more typical quote unquote CrossFit. You're not trying to build up someone's ability to do repeated high volume gymnastics at that stage. What you want them to be able to do is actually express that. So I think it obviously depends on where they're sort of sitting at. What I mainly see is that a lot of people do need to actually just bring back the intensity that they're actually going through and need to build volume, because that's the sort of biggest thing that people have to get used to when they start training in a more sort of competitive way, is that they actually have to now have training volume under their belt so they can recover from training. But then they need to have, you've spoken in the past, Todd, about functional volume. Like they need to be able to getting X amount of reps in certain different movements and certain movement patterns every single week. It becomes less about, hitting your strength piece and hitting your 20-minute Metcon as hard as you can for the day, going home and then just sleeping it off and waking up the next day, being a little bit sore, doing something a little bit different, but again, hitting it with the same intensity. What it becomes about now is making sure that when you're going through the week, okay, typical example, what I will usually do is like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday type situation. They're usually going to be sort of more intense days, and that's where I'm really trying to make sure that people are taking care of their training priorities. And then the Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, those days tend to be a little bit lower in terms of overall stress. If someone's going through a period of accumulation, it's about making sure that they week after week are doing just a little bit more, but then again aren't overreaching to the point where that's, like you said, that's going to create long-term issues, but short-term results. And then also just making sure that I include some level of downtime within that as well. And it could be every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever, but you're looking at some level of quote unquote deload. But then as well as that, enough practice of the sport so that they're not rusty and that they sort of, they're feeling the sort of the intensity once per week of what they're likely going to be feeling several times throughout a competition.
So let's try to break down the some tangible takeaways for people based upon that, right? So I think that one of the things that you mentioned that is really important for creating an appropriate amount of stress is that concept of volume that you were talking about. And then not just how much volume are you doing in a specific week, but actually what is your tolerance to volume that you've built up over time, right? Because if you do, just go online and look for some sort of popular training program that is designed for CrossFit competitors, that might be something that is in fact a very effective program for people at a certain level. But if you're not at that level and you haven't accumulated that amount of volume, if you just jump into it, you're going to get destroyed. And then it's not like, oh man, I need to recover more. So what am I going to do to improve my recovery? Oh, cool. I see this ad on Instagram for something that's going to like make my calves twitch while I watch Netflix at night. Like, no, that's not going to help you. But building up the volume to actually do that training program, which may take you potentially years, is something that is going to be helpful. So what do you think about in terms of understanding where someone is at with their volume and then what that progression should look like?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to obviously, having the conversations at the start whereby you understand what they did for training previously, and then trying to get people to realize that at the start when I am working with someone, it's, what you're trying to do is you're trying to there is an element where I would say that I'm a little bit too reserved in the amount of volume that I give people, and I try to be really, really incremental and also give them the options. So giving them, say, like, okay, they have a bunch of 500 meter row repeats. I'll write down something like 4 to 6 sets, and I'll give them the opportunity, and I'll say, okay, as soon as you start to feel like you lose pace beyond the 4th round or the 4th set, just completely just stop, stop the session. And then that way, what you do is you just have, you create a focus on doing quality work. Because I think what people, like I've seen things like, for instance, just random generic entry-level programming, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, we're going to do 10 500 meter row repeats. And if someone has not done that before, it's like, after the 6th one, they're done. And it's trying to understand that, okay, are you used to this type of training? Yes or no? No? Okay, cool. We're going to be really incremental in this. And I think I heard Dr. Quinn Hennock. He's a physical therapist who works quite closely with like Juggernaut training systems. I think I heard him on a video once, and he was talking about, obviously, every single time you have this real high peak in performance, whether that's going to be like a setting a PB or PR, or even just like a really tough training session, you're always going to see some level of drop coming out of that. So if you see a real steep increase in someone's training volume or someone's essentially just like their performance, you're probably going to see some drop off as well. And he says that for him, he coaches weightlifting, that he tries not to increase things by, say, for instance, he uses the heuristic that don't increase anything by over 10% from training session to training session. If you're going to increase the intensity of someone's back squat session by trying to get them to lift heavier, don't add on extra reps as well. Try to have some level of understanding of, okay, are we trying to do exactly the same but more, or are we trying to do something that's even harder and we probably need to do a little bit less? And it's a sort of understanding that balance between the two.
Yeah, you mentioned something in there that I want to highlight, which is that you're talking about the row repeats and giving people, sort of a set range. But a big clue if someone is training outside of their current capacity is if they're unable to actually nail the training stimulus that you're asking them to, right? If you're seeing that someone is, repeatedly falling off their paces, if someone is repeatedly unable to do, the back squat sets at whatever rep range or weight you expect them to do, if someone is having, in their more CrossFit workouts, their round times are just like falling apart by the end of the workout. If they're just repeatedly not able to execute the training session appropriately, that's potentially an indication that the actual stress load of that training session is going to be too high relative to their capacity or relative to the actual amount of volume that they've been able to accumulate in those specific movements. So something else that I wanted to ask you about, right? I mean, we're talking about this idea of volume and how much you can actually... Go ahead.
Yeah, you asked me in a second. I just want to follow up with a point, because it's like I basically used to make the mistake of sort of viewing training as, I would give, especially with like energy system work, I would give people guidelines as to like how they should pace something. Like a typical example is just like trying to get someone to increase their pace throughout the interval. And I sort of had this mindset whereby it was almost just like a similar mindset to scaling a CrossFit workout. It was pretty much just like, okay, well, you need to reduce your paces until you can do this. And then what I did is, well, what I've had to do is I've had to sort of just change it completely, whereby I've basically said, okay, well, this person doesn't have the ability to increase the intensity throughout the interval. So we need to go back and we just need to still work on, just working on things where they are looking to sustain paces. And I think I just had this sort of mentality whereby, most training methods or training pieces were appropriate for everyone, as long as they hit them relative to their ability. But then what I realized was actually sometimes it's not actually appropriate for people, and they can just get a lot better by doing something that is a lot simpler. And I think that's a key, is just trying to understand that, not all training methods or not all training, sort of, if you look at it as sort of a continuum, it's sort of almost, okay, unless someone can create power in a rested state, and unless someone can actually, keep slower distances repeatable, they're not going to be able to do the stuff in the middle, which means that they have to try to keep high paces repeatable. So that's something that I made a mistake with before, and I think it's important to sort of understand that sometimes some training pieces are just not appropriate for some people.
Yeah, I think that the other big thing I want to touch on, which you did mention previously in this conversation, is also within a weekly template, having some days that are more focused on, intensity, or, are going to be more stressful days, and then some days that are focused more on not even necessarily recovery, but are going to be an opportunity for that individual to recover from the more stressful training stimulus. So how do you think about setting up those, let's call them high and low days, which is a concept from a lot of endurance training, and like the weekly template of a CrossFit athlete?
Like what I'll usually do is I'll just look at things that will, I'll look at sort of the type of stress that will create in the training week. So if we're looking at, say, for instance, a lot of heavy barbell work on a certain day, on those days I'll usually put in elements of sort of harder conditioning. So there's a little bit more intensity there. I'm looking sort of at structural loading as well. So how much, if you sort of like look at it from maybe like a more traditional weightlifting, powerlifting view, it's sort of like, okay, what's the tonnage of that session? And then on the days where I'm not necessarily looking at trying to create those higher intensities, and I'm looking for a lower intensity day, it might be about giving those people things that are actually difficult to do but don't necessarily play a huge stress on the body. So we're looking at things that don't have a large level of like eccentric movement within them. They might be working a lot more on weighted carries, or they might be working more on their aerobic system. They might be working more on their gymnastic skills. They might be doing more play type stuff. Things that aren't going to be wrecking them, and have like, they might be hard in the session. They might have just as much perceived difficulty in the 90-minute session as they had, on the intense training day. However, the residue effect of that session is not going to be as great as, say, for instance, the intense training sessions, because I think that's what you have to sort of understand, is that there's this, you can still get better at certain things, and I think that there is a lot of room to get better at certain things that don't necessarily have like a large sort of like a recovery lag, you could call it. I think there's probably some language in physiology that puts it a lot more eloquently than that. But what we're looking at is just trying to make sure that there's enough difficulty in the session that they're not, just doing like a recovery effort on everything, but at the same time that they're not wrecking themselves. And a mistake I quite often see is that they'll go through like training sessions or training weeks whereby they alternate essentially heavy days. I'm just going to do all my weight training on this day. On the next day, I'm just going to do all of my Metcon stuff, and I'm going to alternate like that. And I'm going to go through maybe 2 or 3 cycles of that throughout the week. But then on their day where they're just doing conditioning, they're doing 200 wall balls and a shitload of like light power snatches that places just such a high eccentric demand on the body that their legs are just smashed for the rest of the week, and they attribute it towards the heavy squats that they did. But in all fairness, the things that make you sore in training and the things that feel really hard, it's actually going to be the things that you place a lot of that eccentric demand on the body. I think I once did a workout, and it was the most sore I've ever been. And it was a workout from Rob Orlando, and it was like 100 back squats of body weight for time. And I just couldn't walk for the next few days. But then I've done like, really, really, really heavy training days, and I've not been sore at all. So I think that people have to understand that, and also just understand, there's the sort of analogy of the cup, and there's all the stresses going into the same cup, and if you overfill that cup, you have to be understanding of the different types of stresses that you're playing on the body, and then just trying to make sure that you can intelligently design things so that it allows for recovery within the week, within the cycle, within the year, and eventually that individual is going to be making improvement.
Yeah. So to sum it up, I think that if someone is feeling under recovered, feeling beat up, feeling like they need to be doing more for the recovery, it's probably not a lack of muscle stim and adrenal support that's making them feel that way. It's probably that they're attempting to do a training program that is not necessarily in alignment with their ability to recover from it. In terms of things that they can control, I think that the stuff that you just touched on, Luke, there is going to be the most important stuff that will help them, right? And that's going to be figuring out sort of where they're at from a volume accumulation standpoint over the sort of like lifetime of their training career, right? Are you attempting to suddenly jump way up in terms of the amount of stuff that you're doing on a weekly basis? And if so, you just might not be able to adapt to it. And then are you able to actually maintain sustainability and repeatedly nail the training stimulus that the program is intending? Or are you just kind of like suffering through stuff and, slogging through and falling apart and having a ton of attrition on your paces and, not hitting your numbers on your snatch or your squat? And then on a weekly basis, are you actually thinking about, okay, am I doing all hard days in the gym, or am I having some polarization in my training where some days I am going fast, I am going hard, I am accumulating more eccentric volume, and other days aren't necessarily, active recovery, quote unquote, but don't have quite as much stress on the system to actually give an opportunity to recover. So I think that those are the main takeaways that are going to help people's recovery, independent of their sleep, their nutrition, their genes, which, they either can't control or are podcasts totally separate from this one. And then, all the marginal stuff, like, yeah, it's cool. Some of it might actually be helpful. I encourage my athletes who have the bandwidth to do a lot of that stuff. And I've certainly in the past done some of it myself. I don't think it's bad, but I do think that there is a misconception that if someone is feeling under recovered, it's because they're not doing enough of that stuff. And it's usually not the case.
Yeah, definitely. Like I've always found that usually when I felt like the most wrecked from training is when I've been doing something where I've been writing it myself, because I've just wanted to like cram way too much in. And then when I have had, training written by other people, and I've been following something that I have had sort of like no attachment to, it's usually been when I'm feeling the best. And, when you do finish training, like if you're feeling wrecked at the end of every single training session, and you're feeling like the way I sort of like to describe it is that in the week, you should probably feel pretty tired on like 2 or 3 days. But if you're going into the gym and everything is, not going your way, you're feeling it really, really, really difficult to get into the session, all this type of thing, chances are you're probably doing too much if you are taking care of all of those other things. So like you said, I think that it comes down to the training and then making sure that obviously those lifestyle factors are in fact play, and no amount of growth mindset is going to change who your parents are.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.